Hi, folks. I'm Denise Howell, and you're about to join us for This Week in Law. Amina Fazlullah is our guest this week. She's a tech policy fellow with Mozilla, and she specializes in net access to underserved communities. We'll talk a lot about that today, as well as the FCC's recent vote on Lifeline services, digital redlining, and whether ISPs should be able to charge you to keep your data private. Matt Curtis co-hosts along with me next on This Week in Law.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiL.
Bandwidth for This Week in Law is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is TWiL, This Week in Law with Denise Howell, Mike Keys, Emery Rohn, and Matt Curtis. Episode 407, recorded November 17th, 2017. Can't we all get connected? Hi, folks. I'm Denise Howell, and you're joining us for This Week in Law. We're so glad that you've been able to join us this week, as we have a truly superstar guest with us this week, who I'm thrilled to introduce you to in a moment. But first, I'll introduce my co-host, Matt Curtis. Great to see you again, Matt.
Yeah, great to be on again. It's been a couple weeks, and thanks for bringing me back on, and really excited to have Amina. So thank you, Amina, for taking the time.
Yes, from me as well. Matt is a second-year law student at Notre Dame. Mike Keys, my other regular co-host, is not available this week, so we are soldiering on without him. Emery Rohn, too, will be back at some point in the near future. But you've got me and Matt today, and also Amina Fazlullah is our guest. Amina has devoted her career to working to further government policies to address the communications needs of vulnerable communities, and she's done that in a number of ways. At the moment, she is a tech policy fellow with Mozilla. She has been policy advisor and directing council vice chair at the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. She is a member of the FCC Consumer Advisory Committee and has had really a number of other wonderful positions on her resume. We're thrilled to have you here with us today, Amina.
Hi, I'm really glad to be here too.
And we don't have Amina's video for those of you who are joining us via video, but we do have a wonderful, wonderful photo of her. So we're thrilled to be able to show you. That's Lake Louise, you said?
Yep, just like some vacation pictures for everyone to enjoy.
It's gorgeous. Now I want to go visit Canada. Okay, well, some other time, because today we are going to talk a lot about government policy with respect to the internet and how it specifically impacts vulnerable communities, both economically or folks who otherwise have issues with accessing and using the internet. So let's start out. A lot of that stuff, obviously, is in the legislation and policy realm. Amina, I wanted to kind of start out our discussion and frame our discussion today with your post from October to Medium, bringing broadband to the unconnected, that you wrote in your capacity as a Mozilla Tech Policy Fellow. It really sort of sets the stage for government policies in this area, and will help, I think, bring some context to the specific things we're going to talk about in a few minutes on later in the show. Here you're giving the example, a very positive and hopeful example of the town of Beatty, Nevada. Am I saying that right? Beatty?
Beatty.
Beatty, Nevada. Can you tell us what's going on there?
So in Beatty, Nevada, they've actually worked with the local rural electric co-op to bring fiber to a 1,000-person town. And this is just over the border from Death Valley. It's a really rural area. And so for the students and the residents of that town, it means that they're going to be connected to high-speed internet. And be able to do distance learning and have access to all the benefits that broadband brings. So it's a really exciting story because oftentimes these types of places are left unconnected. Providers find it too expensive to participate in those communities. So this is in fact a really hopeful story to see how a community found a way to connect themselves.
Right. And so what did Beatty, Nevada have to do? Who did they partner with, and how did they connect themselves to broadband in this way?
Well, it takes all hands. There's a governor in the state that's very pro broadband. There is community members that have been very pro broadband as well. I think it's good to point out that it takes not just like the interest of the local government, but it also takes a willingness to partner with the folks that you need to partner with. Oftentimes, communities ask their sort of biggest provider in town, and if that provider hasn't already started providing broadband service to your community, they probably have a reason as why they haven't already done it. And convincing them to do so may be pretty difficult. You know, it could come as easily as in the form of like some reduced regulations or some more favorable tax benefits. But sometimes there's very little that towns can do to get that biggest provider involved. And it takes a more local provider, somebody with some skin in the game. So they actually partnered with Valley Electric, which is a rural electric co-op. And if that sounds like it's a similar story, it's because electricity went through the same thing. When we were working on rural electrification, what we often found was that these communities were going to be served by the small businesses, the small rural electric co-ops that are going to be reaching out to these small communities and putting kind of their skin in the game to make sure that these communities are up and running. And it looks like they are taking up broadband as well. So Valley Electric actually partnered with some small telecom providers that are close to Las Vegas and is working to run fiber up sort of the highway corridor to Beatty and make sure that they're connected. And so it's not like a story of, oh, well, you just have to hand people a lot of money or depend on your biggest provider or, you can't trust any kind of industry. It's a story of people working together. But the number one thing that sort of comes out of it is a commitment to serving the community with the highest possible service. A lot of these communities often get left out with just, say, the easiest possible service. So rural communities are often connected by satellite because it takes less on the infrastructure side to be able to do that. That's incredibly expensive, and the quality of service is pretty low, and the usability at the end of the day is also pretty low. And sometimes, depending on what the terrain is like, it's just not a great option. So it was really interesting to see how committed everybody was to getting high quality service to this community.
Yeah, I loved your post, and I love this hopeful story of Beatty. But maybe you should describe for us what communities like Beatty and countless other communities throughout the U.S. Looked like before they were able to put together this kind of access. You touched on the satellite option. For those of us who don't have satellite internet service, we're probably familiar with it from seeing ads on TV for something like Usenet Gen 4 or Gen 5, I guess now they have now. What is that option like? It's you were just touching on saying it's very expensive and it's probably not as fast as you think it's going to be.
Right. Pricing really depends on where people are located. But it's often, at least double the cost of what somebody in a, major metropolitan area would experience, but the speeds are far lower. And I would say the quality of service is incredibly spotty because of the type of technology used. So weather and terrain can affect satellite service, which, in rural areas is often the case, that they have pretty severe weather or difficult terrain. So it's not a really great option. It's more like an option.
Right.
And then, otherwise you're trying to work off of maybe existing twisted pair like copper line, which, is, what we would know as dial-up or DSL service. And that's only if the service provider in your area has decided to upgrade and provide you with DSL access. It's unclear what kind of speeds you're going to get. So, hopefully you're getting something around 10 down, 1 up. But it may not be as fast as all that, which is not very fast at all, right. Especially if you're talking about doing something like distance education, or you've got a small business that's really just not a reliable enough connection to really benefit from economically or educationally.
You've brought up distance education a couple of times. Is that because you're talking some of the time here about communities that don't have local education that their students will be attending, that they have to do distance education because they must be homeschooled because that's how rural the community is?
Well, usually what I'm referring to with distance education is like sort of the supplementary pieces that major metropolitan area schools have access to. So you've got more teachers, right? You've got teachers with more variety of backgrounds. You might be able to learn other languages. You might be able to do more robust STEM education, coding. It's just a matter of access to resources more than necessarily homeschooling.
I see.
Yeah. And in fact, I think if they're, for those who are homeschooling, most of them are utilizing resources through the internet. So for communities where homeschooling is, I think, more popular, access to the internet it's a very important component of homeschooling as well, in terms of making it a robust option.
Right. So education is one key area where people desperately need broadband access. We used to think of broadband as a luxury in other areas. Not every, you might not have a lot of sympathy for people who aren't able to, at the drop of a hat, stream every Netflix show at very high quality. But that too, does sort of put you in a different cultural situation than the rest of the country, to be sure. But we're not just talking about using the internet for entertainment anymore. The internet is so pivotal to just about every aspect of people's lives. Their healthcare, scheduling an appointment to get their car serviced. What am I leaving out, Amina?
Banking, insurance. Like access to government services, because especially in rural areas, there are limited hours, and getting to an office in person is difficult, or in order to save from local government all the way up to the federal government, we're closing down offices. We're getting rid of paper documents. We're trying to get everyone to move online. So that means for folks who are more dependent on government services, who tend to be either low income or potentially who live in rural areas or tribal lands, or are part of difficult to reach communities where they might be non-English speakers, new Americans, immigrant populations. These access points these in-person access points are disappearing, and you have to go online. So, government services, I think, is one that's incredibly important as well.
Amina,
go ahead, Matt.
I'm just going to jump in real quick. So I'm assuming that there's regional differences in terms of who really needs this help, because if you're a small town but you're nearer to a population center, you're more likely to have broadband access. But when you're segmenting the population and trying to see who you and your foundation can help best, what are the population numbers that you're looking at?
So, I would hesitate to assume that if you're close to a major metropolitan area that you would have access.
Okay.
So what we often find is there are rural areas that are underserved or unserved, as well as tribal lands, and I think people can grasp that pretty easily, just knowing these are faraway places or there isn't as much infrastructure in place. But there's also urban underserved, and I think what that gets to is digital redlining. And that's sort of at the heart of why these communities are underserved. Broadband providers go where their return on investment is best. And there are policies in place to try to encourage investment in areas that are hard to reach or expensive to reach, so that providers receive some kind of supplement or benefit. The Universal Service Program is one of these programs that the federal government has in place to support building out to rural communities and hard-to-reach communities. But even with that support, it takes a fair amount of hand-holding to ensure that these communities actually have access. And we're just now transitioning some of this support in the past few years to be focused on voice and telephone service to transition to focus on broadband. So there's some significant gaps, and it has less to do with population density and more to do with sort of perceived return on investment from the industry side.
Do you still encounter a lot of lawmakers, and I assume you encounter a lot of lawmakers in your capacity on the FCC Consumer Advisory Committee? Do you encounter a lot of them that say dial-up is just fine? DSL and dial-up speeds are going to work for the kinds of core concerns that you're talking about, healthcare, banking, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think what we've gotten is folks in the policy space, so policymakers or policy advocates, they understand the importance of the internet, but now it's a matter of what level of quality of service do we provide? What level of quality of service do we support? And what I've advocated is to sort of keep your eyes on the horizon. If you sort of nitpick around, well, 10.1 is good enough or 25 is good enough or whatever that is, and it's sort of static, you start to create sort of like a secondary world of internet access. And for those of us who are paying for access and utilizing it, we're sort of driving how, lives are shaped by broadband access. So, we're driving changes in banking, we're driving changes in access to government, civic participation, and changes in education and healthcare, access to insurance. And that matters. It matters because, those applications are going to be built for the more robust, connected folks, and that starts to still leave people behind that are going to be in sort of that less connected realm. So it's important to, I think, talk about use and sort of function as sort of your lodestar, as opposed to sort of numbers around access. And of course, it'll differ, and you're going to have to push it over time. Like a difficult to reach community won't necessarily start out with fiber, but it's worth trying to get them the best possible service, as opposed to sort of assuming from the get-go that we should start at this lower level, and then being potentially sort of reluctant or having it sort of calcify into, well, we've got access, so let's not think about it anymore, because that does pose problems down the road.
Right. And we were talking about the entertainment piece of the internet, but I think that people too forget. I love your notion of keeping your eyes on the horizon, because what happens as technologies change and adapt, and markets respond to how people use the internet, certain technologies go by the wayside. I wonder if any of us on the show here today still own and or use a DVD player. You have a small child. I mean, when I had a small child, I used to play DVDs for that child a lot. That's how long ago it was. Today, I don't think I would do that. So you see how access to things like educational videos is going to shift when it now becomes a component of a teacher in a classroom that they need broadband to be able to play, say, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington for the class. Right. Is that something that the FCC and the folks developing policy in this area keep in mind?
Yeah, Commissioner Rosenworcel, Jessica Rosenworcel, she mentioned early on in the development of updates to the E-rate program, which is another Universal Service Fund program, about the importance of the homework gap. And, what that phrase means is, when you put a lot of emphasis in schools to adapt to using technology or to support their use of technology, you've got to make sure that if you're going to have your textbooks on a tablet, and the tablet requires internet access to be able to access those textbooks, when they go home, that tablet shouldn't go dark. And there are students right now who go home and they don't have any access. So they've got to cobble it together however they can, whether that's going to McDonald's or Starbucks or trying to go to the local library. And that means also potentially spending more time outside of the home, which could be dangerous depending on where they live. So there's a whole host of issues that come with this homework gap, as she calls it, and making sure that access continues from school to home, so that students have access to not just their textbooks and their ability to do homework, but their ability to do research, their ability to access free tutoring resources like Khan Academy or other resources or whatever the next type of resource will be down the road.
Right. I think I want to move on here and talk about some recent developments from this week and also go back to the digital redlining issue that you raised. But before I do, Matt, I just wanted to make sure you don't have any sort of big picture questions for Amina before we drill down a little deeper.
Yeah, I think we're going to stay kind of in the same realm, so we can move on to the next topic.
Okay, so let's talk about digital redlining since we raised that. People might not know what that is. Amina, can you explain?
So there's a few different issues that sometimes digital redlining is the phrase is used for. The phrase what I'm focusing on when I say digital redlining is actual deployment of infrastructure. And where it's deployed. So like traditional redlining is sort of avoiding communities that, for whatever reason, an industry would not prefer to serve or didn't think was lucrative enough to serve. So these communities would just sort of be redlined out of service. So right now there are definitely broadband communities. Actually, the National Digital Inclusion Alliance has done a great report talking about issues in Cleveland around digital redlining and taking a look at how communities within Cleveland have been underserved or not served by providers in their community. And basically, it's usually, like I said, driven by return on investment. It's just a matter of building out where, they get the most bang for their buck. But usually communities work with providers in the past. There were sort of local franchising deals or state rules where they would say, if you're going to come into this community, a community could designate, where you need to build to. There's been sort of a steady pushback on these types of rules at the local level and at the state level to try to eliminate these types of requirements or this kind of local oversight. And so Cleveland is a good example of what happens when you push back on this type of local oversight, and what happens, a few years down the road. So a few years ago, there was a change to franchising rules and this type of sort of build-out oversight. The promise was, we don't need this type of interference from the local level. That's what's preventing build-out to communities in Cleveland. And what's happened since that rollback had occurred is that there is now definitely swaths of Cleveland that are unserved or underserved when it comes to broadband. So it seems like, losing that local input has actually made the problem worse and not better. Is that a good explanation? Or
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So this is obviously impacting a lot of communities, and it seems like there might be differing views in Washington as to how to deal with that. On the one hand, and you made some comments to Gizmodo on this topic a while back. It comes up in the net neutrality discussion. There seems to be on one side, particularly perhaps in coming from our FCC chairman Ajit Pai, that rolling back net neutrality requirements could help this by giving businesses, broadband providers, more flexibility as to how they can deploy, where they can deploy resources and address this problem. But I think what you've been touching on here and what you are quoted on in this article is that while it's fine to want to incentivize businesses to expand, at some point, government needs to regulate and say we've left you to your own devices and you haven't expanded to this area, so now we're going to make sure that you do. Am I capturing that debate properly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is, the tension is how can you encourage deployment, right? I think at the top line for everybody, for Chairman Pai and for folks like me, is that we want communities to be connected. How you get there, I think, is where we differ. When a provider has been given resources like the Connect America Fund or, changes to local franchising rules, sort of the freedom to build where they choose, tax benefits or reduced fees, and they're still not serving communities. You can't go back to the same pot of another sort of supportive handout to industry and expect them to then turn around and do the thing they haven't been doing. So, I'm of the opinion that at the very least, you shouldn't tie the hands of local government officials and state government officials from using whatever means necessary to be able to get their community access to broadband. So they should be inventive. They should be able to, innovate and create new partnerships, whether that's with a new provider, whether it's, putting out a request for proposal around fiber, not with, the big telco in town, trying to incentivize competition within their community. Oftentimes, a lot of sort of the industry-centric proposals to sort of give them another thing winds up giving the same sort of big provider in town the big plum benefit. But it's that, next competitor that's going to be hungry to actually serve this community. So supporting competition, I think, would be a really helpful thing, allowing local communities to kind of rule their own community and their own destiny when it comes to broadband deployment, I think is really important as well. And that's actually something that the last administration did during the last FCC. The chairman of the FCC, Chairman Wheeler at that time, pushed really hard to try to allow for more local control, because there had been a number of state-level bills pushing back on the ability of local government officials from sort of doing just that, choosing their own broadband destiny. And in a very odd move, legally speaking, it was the federal government that was sort of prohibiting the preemption. It's like prohibiting the pushback from the state level of this lack of local control, which is, yeah, it just puts your head around in circles.
Yes, it does a bit. Libby, what's her last name? Libby Watson wrote up this piece for Gizmodo. And of course, we have all of our discussion points that we've used to prepare for the show today available to you if you'd like to check them out in detail. They are at tagpacker.com/user/thisweekinlaw. We're on episode 407 this week. And Libby got a little heated about this when writing this up. And doesn't like or doesn't think that it's enough to just say we're going to give you incentives and the freedom to invest and go where you think it makes business sense, ISPs. And she writes, how much cash do they need before they get around to investing in the poor? AT&T had a cash flow of $16.9 billion last year. Does that need to be $30 billion or $50 billion or $100 billion before the company gets around to investing in the poor? So that's when you stepped in and said, there's not always a business case for ISPs to get into every community. And so what does it look like when we're putting in a layer of regulation that says, okay, you have to invest in these areas of Cleveland or Detroit or what have you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the USF program is one example of that. That's how we built out our telephone network. It's the same problem that occurred with rural electrification. It needed government hands to help push it along, either in the form of support subsidies or in the form of regulations. So the USF fund is a fund that's actually doesn't come out of the U.S. Treasury. It's not taxpayer funded. It's a fund that the telcos came together and built through ratepayer funds. And so there's a little designation on your voice service that says USF fund, and there's a fee that you pay.
What does the acronym stand for? USF?
Universal Service Fund.
Mm-hmm.
And that pot of money is the same pot of money that telcos then take out of to be able to serve a rural community or a community that just doesn't have the return on investment. So, it's just the importance of the network is, having it in all places. So, it's not just, connecting New York for New York's sake. You've got to be able to connect to Kansas. And so that's the benefit of having a robust network. And, I'll take it a step further. If you're going to be a country that, is taking advantage of the full economic benefits of technology, then you've got to make sure that your entire country has full access to the networks, whether it's electricity or the roads, highways, internet, telephone. So, I think that the USF program comes from that sort of thinking that, to be a real player, to actually bring the full benefits of whatever the technology is that's important at the time, this program sort of helps make that happen. So USF does that for telephone. In the past few years, it's been updated to focus on the Connect America Fund now focuses on broadband. And it's arguable how to best do that. What the Connect America Fund does is provide it buffers that return on investment, that perceived loss that occurs from going into hard to reach communities. But, I think Libby's point is well taken. It's unclear how much it actually costs to connect communities. It's shocking that we can't just rattle that number off, but it's considered to be proprietary information. And so it's rare that, I have very few people that I could reach out to that might even know, what the cost of broadband to, Beatty, Nevada would have been versus, New York City versus, some suburban town. So Paoli, Pennsylvania. And, that I think is at the heart of what makes this policy the policy around these issues really difficult.
Yeah, that sounds...
Sorry, one question and then you, Matt. Can and does the FCC or Congress bring in the telcos and tell them, look, we understand this is confidential proprietary information. We're not going to make it public, but you have to give these numbers to us so that we can make policy that makes sense. Does that happen?
So there's definitely requests that go out, and depending, I think, on sort of the change of administrations and the difference of opinion of what type of information gathering should be done, the FCC's requests change over time. So this current chairman has watered down some of the requests to industry in terms of better understanding, kind of the state and the health of broadband. So these requests do go out to industry, and they are supposed to be held sort of as private information, confidentially, but they're by and large voluntary. There isn't really sort of the stick that comes with this request, and so oftentimes that information either doesn't come back in a form that's usable, or it's not shared, and it's unclear, how it can be incorporated into public policy if you don't have access to it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Matt, what were you going to ask?
Just kind of astounding that those kind of numbers just aren't available. It seems like, with all of the grants and the tax incentives that we give to broadband companies, that should be the quid pro quo for that's sort of like, what's your cost of doing business, and being able to assess, like, okay, if there's no ROI interest issue in certain areas, you could fill gaps, but if we don't know that information, we can't make like logical business decisions about that. So we've talked a lot about like where things aren't going well, but it seems like there must be some examples of, two of the main takeaways I've gotten is that, one, it's that in some places it's that there's one main broadband provider that's looking at only their revenue model and only their ROI model, and that maybe having different competitors in the market would create different ROI models, which would allow them to serve different populations. And so has there been anywhere that's done that well? And then in terms of like incentivizing areas that have been redlined, has there been states or municipalities who have done a good job of working with these providers to either use the carrot or the stick to get them into areas where they haven't been?
Yeah, so I'd say there's some interesting stories where you've got like municipalities that have kind of taken things on for themselves. So, for example, Longmont in Colorado has passed at the city level has like made a decision to build their own network. So that's above and beyond the sort of pushback that they had at the state level. They had to actually pass a referendum which is, a pretty big hurdle to be able to sort of get around the big providers and do sort of their own local piece. There's been some sort of interesting models where folks will start to put out a request for proposal. Like, for example, in Montana, there was a school district that put out a request for proposal, and they were able to find an out-of-state provider who decided to come in and provide fiber, even though the in-state provider probably had the technical capability to do it. But instead of actually putting in a proposal, they just pushed back through government. And they sort of pushed through a campaign saying that this community was overbuilding. So that's not to kind of go down the negative route again. One of the things that you end up seeing is that the sort of biggest provider in town has a really powerful voice in local politics and state politics. And so they can often push back through politics instead of competition. And usually they'll hit that button first. And overbuilding, the claim of overbuilding is usually the one you hear first, is that either it's government-sponsored anti-competitive behavior because you've got this government-sponsored competitor, or you're building networks that are unnecessary because you're spending money on running another line where there's already an existing line.
Yeah, so that kind of...
Sorry, go ahead, follow up.
Just a quick follow-up. That seems to push in both directions then on the local control over these decisions then, because in some areas you have local entities who are doing, local governments who are doing a good job of pushing legislation that's going to increase access. And in other instances, you have them kind of being co-opted by business, their local providers, to prohibit competition. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes it's more at the state level where we see industry go in. I'm sure you're aware the legislative season in most state governments is pretty short. The legislators are often unpaid and volunteer in some ways. The elected officials are there with limited understanding of some of these issues. So when industry comes in, they're a big voice. So at the state level, we've seen a lot of sort of negative things in terms of local control over broadband. At the very local level, it typically runs the other direction. Usually you see local government is just fully aware of what their community needs. And most of these folks are only engaged in local government because they really care deeply about the community they live in. They've heard maybe the line before. They're fully aware of what's being done on the ground. So you can't really pull the wool over their eyes because they know that, this provider has been here for X amount of years and hasn't really served them well.
Hasn't done anything.
Right. At the state level, it may not be their community that's impacted. It might not be their district that's impacted. And so it often kind of goes over their heads, or for whatever reason, the idea that it might impact a neighboring community negatively doesn't seem to sway them enough. I've actually seen sort of this odd dichotomy where at the state level, you worry a lot about, the short legislative season and the sort of the powerful voice of industry kind of co-opting the conversation, whereas at the local level, those voices are robust and aware, but, can get sort of pushed aside depending on what happens at the state level.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Very interesting. I've raised Detroit a couple of times on the show. Let's talk about a couple of examples of things flowing out of Detroit or happening in Detroit. On this issue of digital redlining, Detroit is the locus of one lawsuit on this topic filed by Edward Garner Taylor and Ray Taylor who are alleging that AT&T is engaging in redlining. AT&T denies that, but they're relying on an analysis by Dr. Brian Whitaker, maybe, who is in the Agricultural Economics Department at Oklahoma State University. He has done an analysis that the plaintiffs here argue demonstrate that AT&T has withheld fiber-enhanced broadband improvements from most Detroit neighborhoods with high poverty rates, relegating them to internet access services which are vastly inferior to the services enjoyed by their counterparts nearby in higher income Detroit suburbs. It also seems like Detroit is not the only place that's going to be or has been subject to digital redlining lawsuits. So maybe you can speak to if regulation is one means of incentivizing broadband providers, speak to how effective the lawsuit strategy is, Amina.
The lawsuit strategy, I think, is a really difficult route to take. I think what is beneficial about a lawsuit strategy is that you are bringing the issue into the forefront. It's one that's hard to see, and it demonstrates, it kind of allows you the freedom to sort of dive into the details and discuss what's going on. But it's a huge hurdle. These companies have incredible resources available to them. And they make sure in advance, that the contracts that they write and that the sort of the agreements that they have with states or with local communities benefits them. And so it's a pretty hard hurdle to meet, and to demonstrate discrimination, through a redlining case, I think it's quite a hard thing to do. Especially when, you've got potentially, depending on sort of their contracts and their agreements, the freedom to sort of choose where they're going to place their lines. If there's an economic argument at play, it's unclear whether or not that, supports or hurts, these claims of discrimination. But I do think that it's important to sort of raise the profile of the issue, and to sort of test how to, push back, kind of pulling on all levers, whether it's on the policy side or through the courts, sort of to push back on these companies and say, we're paying attention and we're going to put you to task to prove up your case. I think that's incredibly helpful, especially at the federal policy level, to have, these cases ongoing, to sort of say, like, look, don't double down on behavior or on supports to industry that behaves in this way. So let's slow down on what we're suggesting is going to be effective policy to connect these very same communities that are now turning around and saying that they've been discriminated against. And that can happen before, the case is finished. So I think it does have sort of an important sort of function in that it raises the issue, and it puts it in play. But I feel like it's an incredibly hard barrier in terms of winning a court case on these discrimination complaints against companies like AT&T, who have incredible resources, and often on the other side, there's very few resources available.
Okay, and I want to stick with talking about Detroit in just a moment. Something people there taking matters into their own hands by filing a lawsuit, and in other ways by building a mesh network. Virgil and IRC submitted a great piece in Motherboard that was just published yesterday that I'm going to bring up in just a second here. But we need to insert our first MCLE passphrase into the show. We put these phrases in just in case you are someone who likes to watch or listen to the show for professional credit in your field. If you are a lawyer, you can head on over to our wiki at wiki.twit.tv, find the This Week in Law page there, and we have a chart that should help you have some information about how to submit in your jurisdiction. We are not an approved provider in any jurisdiction of the United States, but many of those jurisdictions will let you submit programs that you think are educational enough to qualify as legal education credit. And goodness knows that's the industry I know the most about. As I understand it, there are other industries as well where you have continuing education credit requirements, and that this show may help you out with that as well. So we put these phrases in case your oversight board, whatever it may be, needs to have some further demonstration that you watched or listened. Our first one is, can you hear me now? And we'll put another one in as the show goes on. So thank you so much, Virgil, for pointing us toward this piece by Kaylee Rogers, published yesterday at motherboard.com. Also on the topic of Detroit, and Kaylee includes some statistics that I think are staggering and definitely pertinent to our discussion today. She writes that 40% of the population of Detroit has no access to the internet of any kind, not only high speed at home. That's an FCC stat that she's citing there. And that 70% of school-aged children in the city are among those who have no access at home at all of any kind. Detroit, she writes, has one of the most severe digital divides in the country, according to the FCC. So we talked about the folks there who are suing about this. Other folks there are trying to build their own broadband internet through a mesh network. Have you been paying attention to this, Amina?
Yeah, this is pretty exciting stuff. Mesh network, I feel like, is sometimes referred to as like the guerrilla network. It's an option where people really are self-creating, right? And it's sort of the ultimate in a community-based network. I don't know about the details as well, but I do know that it's a really interesting solution where you can sort of build your network through your own sort of like-minded community members, which is really, really a really interesting solution.
Yeah, this motherboard piece says they're installing high-speed internet that beams shared gigabit connections from an antenna on top of the tallest building on the street and into the homes of people who have long gone without. They're starting with 3 underserved neighborhoods. Could you speak to the technology behind that at all? Do you understand the technology behind that at all? What is the antenna actually pulling in, and how does it provide gigabit internet? And why aren't we all doing this?
I honestly, I can't speak to the technology. I wish that I could. Yeah. But, I will say this. One of the biggest difficulties of using wireless networks to cover communities that are unserved, especially in a place like New York, with apartments that have walls that serve as Faraday cages, is that it's hard to use wireless. The coverage is just not great. And so to have a solution, and I'm curious to see, what it's really like inside of the home. But to have a solution that can actually make it inside of the home from sort of a wireless outpost outside the home, I think that's really interesting. And it's great for a place like New York City, where there are urban underserved areas in this very dense footprint. So you can sort of bounce from rooftop to rooftop and, cover a pocket of a community that has been left behind. So, what you often see when you're talking about digital redlining in a place like, say, New York City, is that, as there are like affluent members of a community kind of coming in and putting down roots, you have service starting to trickle in. But for communities that are low income and less affluent, they they just don't have service. One easy way to tell whether or not you're in a community that probably has access to broadband is whether or not they've got a satellite dish outside their window. You can go to the home of Comcast in their backyard in Philadelphia, and you can probably see the gigantic Comcast building through some of these neighborhoods, and you'll see dish after dish after dish after dish. And it should raise questions. Why in Comcast's backyard are there communities at all that don't have access to broadband? And what you often see is that they'll run the cable. But when you call your provider to get broadband, they won't offer it to you, or that you have to buy it bundled. You can't get it standalone. So there's all sorts of sort of limitations to the type of service that actually runs past your house. And these are often in low-income neighborhoods. And so something like this, where you can sort of go right to where the heart of the problem is, especially in a dense area, this is a really great solution. Unfortunately, it's unclear whether or not something like this would be really useful in a rural area. It depends on the type of spectrum that they're using, the type of technology they actually use. But, you've got to be able to kind of put all those antennas around to be able to make a mesh network that's going to be usable. And if you've got, community members that are really dispersed far away, it's unclear where you're going to set up those antennas to be able to connect to the next community member.
Right. Thank God we've got such a geeky audience. Patterson in IRC is speculating this is probably line of sight microwave, then Wi-Fi, which might mean that those Faraday cage walls, like you were mentioning, Amina, might come into play to make it problematic one way or another, but hopefully not for the folks in Detroit that they're working with. And Virgil has let us know that this is the Detroit Community Technology Project that's being profiled here. So if you want information to drill down into their technology, how they're doing the mesh network and how it works, if you go to alliedmedia.org/DCTP, that's where you can get those details. Fascinating stuff. Matt, anything you want to ask or add?
Yeah, I just think this is a really cool project, and very innovative in terms of how to get it into a network where you don't have the money. Detroit's got its fiscal problems and probably can't incentivize infrastructure building that much. So doing something with less wires is really interesting. The other thing is, and it's hard to parse out Detroit's problems economically and all of that, but I would imagine that people who can't get internet will leave, and Detroit's it's dwindled by something like 60% over the last 15 years. And I wonder how much that has to do at all with the lack of these types of services like the internet that people just aren't going to stay for. It certainly has to do with a poor economy and all of that too, but in terms of municipalities and states pushing this, that's something to think about.
Right. And Amina, that's something you focus on in your work, is combating brain drain. That if you can provide internet access, it helps the overall economy thrive, correct?
Yeah. One of the things that we've noticed is that for rural and tribal lands, for areas that are sort of part of, what's been called the Rust Belt, communities that were very industry heavy in the past, and those industries have left, not necessarily rural, but definitely struggling economically because of changes to the economy. Access to broadband can keep people in the town that can bring new services in. So it keeps the youth engaged in the community, as opposed to going out to the next biggest city or to a different spot. And it can even support some of the existing infrastructure or economic drivers in communities that do come in. So, for example, in rural communities and mountainous towns that are really dependent on, say, resorts, skiing in mountainous towns. One of the biggest requests that are starting to come in is making sure that they have internet access. People pay a great deal to come out to these resorts, but if they don't have access to the internet, then you're starting to see people tend to go to places where they do have better access. Those are communities that might be in better shape to be able to do that. But if we can hop from, a resort community in a mountainous town to the next community down the road, then, we can start to build access for the people who work and live there, not just the people who play there. And so the story is similar, but, slightly different for, say, like a mining community. Mining companies are starting to use technology. Agriculture is starting to use technology. So, having solid internet access can make a difference for a community that might be struggling to have enough people to keep their agricultural industry alive or their mining community alive. But having access to technology means that they can continue doing that work without, having, say, a farm completely shut down. And that doesn't even sort of scratch the surface of what it means to have access to sort of educational and job retraining. If workers are able to retrain for the next industry, then, there are more likely to be a new industry that will be willing to come into a town that's got, well-trained workers available, that they can easily access, they can easily retrain, and get up and running for, their factory or whatever their needs are. And so, again, having access to the internet makes a big difference in terms of being able to take advantage of sort of the labor force that's going to be in an area.
All right, Matt, anything else that you wanted to ask on the topic of redlining before we move on to the FCC's vote to scale back the federal Lifeline program?
No, I think we've covered it very well, and it's great to hear what Amina has to say about all this. She's just well versed at it.
Yeah, very much so. Okay, let's talk about the federal Lifeline program, which before the current administration was elected was actually being planned for expansion. Now it's being scaled back. First of all, Amina, what is it?
So the Lifeline program started under the Reagan administration in 1985 to provide low-income individuals with a subsidy to access telephone service. And then in 2005, President George W. Bush expanded it to include mobile service. And then most recently, in 2016, we had an upgrade to include broadband as a supported service. And, the program itself, again, is part of the Universal Service Program, the Universal Service Fund. And it has been, I think, very effective at reaching folks who are unable to access voice services, and it was just starting the transition to include broadband. There are always problems with programs, but this program in particular has had a lot of thought and concern paid to it, especially in the last administration, to upgrade it and improve it so that it's more user-friendly for both the actual Lifeline participants, to encourage like a very competitive, robust field of Lifeline providers, to sort of get the right mix of services between voice, traditional voice, mobile, and broadband, and to have an eye towards shifting it so that eventually it's focused on sort of the most important services, mobile and broadband service ultimately. The changes to the program most recently start to push back on what I just described, those sort of exciting upgrades that had been done during the last administration.
So if I'm understanding it correctly, if you fall between below a certain income threshold, then you're eligible, and you get a subsidy for internet or phone, and that is an or, right? you can use it toward your phone service or your internet service, but not both. And it is. Go ahead.
So you can use it towards bundled services, but the subsidy is $9.25, so it just doesn't go very far. And for folks who are at 135% of the poverty line, chances are that $9.25 isn't going to be, the tipping point in terms of signing up for a bundled service.
So I've never worked in Washington, D.C., but I saw that as I was prepping for the show today, that the threshold is 100. You have to be below 135% of the poverty line to be eligible. Please explain. How can you be 135% of anything?
Yeah. So
I always give 135%, Denise.
Right. I don't know that I can explain how they came to that number, but I will say this. It's about, I believe it's $40,000 for a family of four. It's not a lot.
Yeah.
And so what these families are often facing is a choice between things like medicine, food, water, electricity, housing, or access to telecommunications, whether that's voice or internet. The types of folks who use the Lifeline service are the folks who fall on and off of critical services of all kinds in their life because their monthly income is just so low. So the Lifeline program is truly what it's called. It's a lifeline. It means access to 911. It means access to your child's school if anything goes wrong, to your employers, because most employers expect that they should be able to reach their employees via a phone number. So the traditional voice program, I think, has been really critical. And the broadband program, the addition of broadband within the Lifeline program, I think is really great as well. And, like I mentioned earlier, sometimes you can't do it all in one shot. $9.25, I think, is incredibly low subsidy for a program that is aiming to support both voice and broadband. But, we should expect government to be able to walk and chew gum. So, if they want to start, as they did during the last administration, by at least upgrading the program to include broadband, to change some rules, to encourage different types of providers into the program that would provide broadband service, while keeping critical voice service around, I think that's a good first step. What happens now is there's been a pushback on the non-facilities-based providers. So these are mobile providers for the most part, that are the bulk of the Lifeline providers within the program. So that slashes the types of providers that are available to consumers and sort of the most popular providers that are currently used by Lifeline consumers. So that really severely limits their options. Can you unpack that for us a bit so that people understand what a reseller is here? So like a facilities-based provider would be like sort of your traditional AT&T, and a mobile reseller would be something like TracFone.
So they're buying spectrum from the facilities-based providers. How do they provide the services that they're selling to their customers? So
facilities-based carriers So I'd say the non-facilities-based carriers are usually making some kind of deal to access spectrum. So they do have a lighter footprint. And this usually is what leads to their interest in serving communities with sort of like innovative or, different service offerings. So you'll see Boost Mobile or Track Phone because they're not carrying the weight of sort of the full network. They're usually able to focus on other aspects, price point or different types of phones, different types of communities. That means they're also incredibly limited in their like range of coverage sometimes, and their offerings are usually pretty local. But for folks who are on a limited budget and may not be traveling nationwide, that can be a really good solution. There have been, I think, some real benefits from working with the non-facilities-based providers. And what you can see from the program is that about 75% of the participants who use mobile services use them from, or broadband services, use them from these resellers. So limiting participation away from some of these resellers is going to severely impact today's current use of the Lifeline program.
Right. And why, what's the thinking at the FCC to put a ban on eligibility for the Lifeline subsidy to resellers? What's the logic there?
There have been unscrupulous resellers in the past that have pushed the Lifeline phones in order to sign up folks. They've done double signups, or they've provided very little service, and they've hurt the program in the long run because they've caused an issue around fraud, waste, and abuse. But I would say that it's the job of the FCC to push back and weed out the bad providers from the ones that are actually doing good work. And as somebody who has advocated for low-income consumers and is still advocating for low-income consumers, I have no problem with the FCC holding these resellers to task and making sure that they provide them with effective coverage, enough minutes, high quality of service, that, the 925 that they're getting from the USF program is well used for a service that is important and useful for these communities. So instead of just eliminating it'd make more sense to create tougher standards or to exploit more out of the resellers, or to even just use the existing rules, which the last administration put in place, and sort of administrative structure that they created to weed out any kind of fraud, waste, and abuse. So there's a duplicates database that has done a really good job of weeding out these problems. There's currently the creation of a third-party administrator so that the sort of double signing up can be eliminated, because the actual provider is no longer in charge of signing folks up. It actually has to go through a third party. So there's been a lot of changes to the program that have just gone through to help push back on some of the things that this administration claims is driving their decision. But they're not waiting to let any of those changes actually take effect, which is incredibly disappointing, because ultimately what you're doing is you're just slashing competition out of the program and leaving, 75% of the participants behind.
I have one more question on the Lifeline program, but Matt, I wanted to kick it to you and see what's on your mind about this.
Yeah, I think that what we've seen in this, I think that what this all shows to me is the importance of the president in our current system of administrative rules that that basically, like, there's so much policy discretion that goes into all of this, is that they can have a 180-degree shift in how it affects people's lives without with being within the bounds of the law. But so a lot of what we see, and this is kind of the interesting thing about the Trump administration, is that a lot of these policies are designed in part to serve many of the constituents who end up voting for Trump. But it seems to be an emotional response of, like, the moral hazard of giving people things, and therefore, they don't value them or they won't work or anything like that. How do you try to talk to people about that moral hazard problem of the government giving services to these people, or is that something that's on your radar?
Oh, absolutely. It's something you hear a lot when you talk about the Lifeline program. There's a very paternalistic conversation that comes across, which is troubling. For folks who are at 135% of the poverty line, they're working really hard to try to keep all their balls in the air, whether that's food, shelter, healthcare, transportation to work, and, having a little bit of support, a little bit of help is an incredibly good thing. And when you actually explain what these folks are facing day to day, you do actually get folks to understand, policymakers to understand that how deeply necessary support like this is, and Lifeline is a program that is a stepping stone, right? It's an access program. It's an access to an employer, to education, to healthcare, to emergency services. I mean, the last thing you want are for folks in low-income communities not to be able to call the police or not to be able to call the fire department or an ambulance. And the hazards that affect the rest of the community when a member of your community can't call the fire department. So, there's definitely not just, clear importance to the daily life of somebody who would be eligible, but the effect on the community as a whole when somebody is unconnected is incredibly dangerous. And when you actually lay it out, you start to sort of see the light bulb go off, and that's good to know, but it's definitely frustrating because you often have to overcome this very paternalistic conversation first. Which, is definitely depressing to have to kind of go down to sort of say, no, let's take a look at their budget and let's figure out how somebody is going to be able to keep access to phone service or keep access to the internet. What do you expect out of this family? And what is actually feasible?
My question was actually not about the Lifeline program, but another vote yesterday in the FCC to make it easier for telephone companies to close their old or eliminate their old copper networks, the regular phone line, DSL lines that people would get dial-up or DSL service with. Can you explain that vote for us, Amina? What happened there?
I think the piece that's concerning is this is part of sort of the technology transitions that are occurring. And anytime you have a transition from one type of service to another, we have in the past, for example, with the DTV transition, government has taken a pretty big role in making sure that customers aren't left behind because of sort of the critical function of whatever is the current technology, the role that it has in the lives of consumers. So one of the things that occurred yesterday is that there was a decision where very little notice now, if any notice at all, is now required when these lines are changed and to either shut down or transition to something different. So, for example, you might have had traditional DSL or telephone service, and now you might be forced to switch to a wireless-only service, or the service will just be eliminated altogether. And the types of communities that are hit by these are often communities that are low income, or many seniors are in these communities because they've been holding on to traditional services, either because they might have a healthcare apparatus that requires, a traditional phone line to operate. And so these are folks that are hardest to transition. And as I was describing before, wireless service is always not the best option, especially in communities like these. Sometimes what's driving them is a change after a disaster. So, for example, after Hurricane Sandy, there were communities whose lines were damaged in the hurricane, and instead of repairing these lines, one of the options was to just go wireless, and that essentially meant that these communities would have less service at the end of the day. So not only were they hit by a storm, damaged, and are trying to recover, but now they've got sort of substandard service that doesn't meet what they were able to do in the past. And so that's part of what was the decision that occurred yesterday, was this decision around technology transitions, where there isn't a requirement to provide an adequate replacement, and then sort of the notification protocol as well.
Got it. We're going to move on and talk about a privacy aspect involving access and fairness that's also in Amina's wheelhouse. So something that folks were concerned about when the ISP privacy regulations were rolled back, that went into effect in January, I believe, of this year, is that without those kinds of controls on ISPs, we would see ISPs attempting to introduce programs where if you're not going to have your data surveyed and then ads targeted to you based on what ISPs know about you, you would have to pay extra for that. AT&T actually tried something like that a while ago. It was in connection with its Gigapower fiber internet service. This was back in 2013. They had a plan called Internet Preferences as part of their fiber internet service. And if you did not agree to allow AT&T to look at your traffic in order to then sell that data, you had to pay anywhere from $30 to $100 extra a month to opt out and preserve your privacy. So it's pretty easy to see how that would, in addition to the very stark digital divide that we've been discussing throughout the show, we would begin to have a privacy divide, even among people at least, from this ISP getting broadband services provided. That program is no longer offered, I think, by AT&T, but it's an example of the kind of fear people had about the rollback of the FCC's privacy restrictions. So I'm just wondering, Amina, what the status of this is. If you're starting, it's been several months now that telcos have been able to sort of grapple with new business models, more flexible business models, since they're not going to be subject to those privacy restrictions that the FCC had voted in before this administration came into office. Do you see this kind of program rearing its head again?
I think that we will. I haven't seen it yet, but I do think that there is an opportunity to see it come back. One thing that I find really interesting is that similar to net neutrality, there was an incredible public reaction to pushback on the privacy rules. Yeah. And while, this type of program is targeted at folks who are looking for discounted service, the folks who were pushing back on privacy rules were from sort of all sort of walks of life and in income brackets. And I think there's definitely an understanding that privacy is important. So I would be curious to see, if AT&T would float something like this again, even though they may not get the pushback from the regulators. There was a lot of pushback on the loss of the privacy rules, and there may be sort of like a public relations reason to not stick their neck out and put something like this back on the market.
Right. Getting back to Matt's point about paternalism and handouts, I'm wondering if there's a sense, or I would like to get your temperature on whether you think there's a sense among regulators that people should have the choice to give up their privacy and get cheaper service. That's a right that some regulators don't want to take away from them. What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely think that that's a line of argument that's pretty robust, that, folks should be in control of the decisions that they make. We shouldn't hold everyone's hand. There are benefits to be able to engage in the internet marketplace and trade your data. That all falls down if the consumer is unaware of the value of what they're trading. Mm-hmm. And it's unclear whether or not, even the highest level consumers are aware of what they're trading. So, yeah. I consider myself, a tech policy nerd, and I couldn't tell you what's in, most of the disclosures that I click through on. I'm a lawyer, and, I can tell you I don't read through all of them. And so it's, you give up a lot when you engage in the internet. And it takes a lot of effort to try to keep track of all of that and understand how it's being used. And it's unclear whether or not you have any negotiating power to push back. They call it the frightful five, right? There's just a handful of companies where you can't move on the internet without bumping into. And, how are you supposed to effectively avoid Google or Amazon? It's pretty hard to do that. So it's unclear to me that consumers are going to be the ones that can dictate, their sort of privacy and data future. It's got to be built on the other side. And if companies are unwilling to build it, then it's up to government to encourage them, via carrot or stick to build it in a way that is respectful of individuals' information.
Yep. Matt, any questions or thoughts?
Yeah, just that, the underlying the administrative policy change that was going to be brought about would have been that you could have sold your data, but the baseline would have been that you had the right to privacy and you could have contracted for it. I think that based on I agree with Amina that the baseline understanding of what our understanding of contract is online is that we really don't know what we're contracting for. I don't know too many people who don't agree with that proposition, and so I think it's more than fine to be able to sell your privacy, especially if you already think that it's already being sold to Google and you think it's already being sold to Amazon effectively because they are the big five in the room. But the difficulty is if they don't have to contract with you for the privacy, they're taking it right now without you getting the financial benefit of it. So although optically I don't think it's good to have like two tiers of whether someone has privacy or not. I think that the reality is though that information about you is incredibly valuable, and if you're not able to sell it, then you have to bear the cost of it without any of the benefit. So I wish that we would have stuck with the plan that the outgoing Obama administration had, but that's not the world we're in.
Yeah, and I would just point out one thing, because I noticed that I might have conflated some things, but the plan was around ISPs, so it wasn't talking about anybody on top. So and that's where the FCC's wheelhouse. ISPs have a unique relationship with their users, right? When you contract with AT&T for your phone service, you don't expect every single one of your conversations to be surveilled and recorded and reused. That was sort of the deal. And you do have a contract with them, and you are paying them something
right.
for that service. So the privacy rules that were in place were, focused on ISPs. And so, these are organizations that you pay good money to for a particular service. And then in the course of doing that business, they were hoping to slide out information. Instead of just transferring your traffic, they wanted to record it and use it. And that, I think, is sort of a different concept than the sort of free services, and I'm saying that with some air quotes, that you utilize through companies like Google and Amazon, where you may or may not know that you're giving up information in order to take advantage of search or Gmail or whatever else that you're using. That, like in Facebook, for example, like there's a whole host of services out there that, as a consumer, you might be thinking, I'm using this social network, and that's what this company is. It's, a social networking company. Their widget is your data, not actually social networking. They're catching you. You're the fish. And so, I think that's a different conversation. It's one that's largely been batted around at the FTC, not the FCC. What was unfortunate is part of the conversation around these rules. Now that they're gone, I wonder how important it is to discuss this, but, was to conflate those two. But ISPs are uniquely different in that, we have a very traditional relationship with our ISP. We give them good money for the service that they're offering us, and our expectations are very different in terms of, how we contract with them and what they do with our information. On top of the fact that they are uniquely privy to information. They know your location. They know everything that you're using the internet for. That's incredible rich information. And so presumably, the dollars that are transacted with them and that contract that you've got, should be protective. And that should be a relationship that, deserves, sort of a heightened level of privacy protection. And it's unfortunate that those privacy rules went by the wayside in this administration.
I do derive some hope out of what you raised before, Amina, and that is that the pushback to the removal of those rules was pretty severe and widespread and loud, and that may be why we haven't seen AT&T or others go back to this kind of program where your privacy is given away unless you pay more for the privilege of it not being given away. Hopefully public opinion will continue to act as a check until lawmakers decide to do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've seen other efforts. I know that Facebook tried to encourage and has successfully encouraged in some countries the use of their sort of their internet access, which is sort of this walled garden that's very focused on Facebook. And I know in India there was a great deal of pushback, and there's a lot of confusion over what would happen if you clicked on a link within Facebook. You would start being charged as you actually experienced the real internet.
Right.
and that, for folks who, wanted to access the internet, for them, they wanted to access the internet to do what they wanted, not to just look at Facebook. And so, even though it was a potentially free service, they by and large weren't interested in this walled garden because they weren't able to do what they wanted. And for folks who were brand new to the internet, it was an interesting model to be able to offer some sort of access. But at the same time, if you're completely uninitiated to the world of broadband and the internet, and all you know is the internet looks like Facebook, then you have a very, very narrow and incorrect view of what the internet actually is. And you don't actually know how to operate on the web, and you don't know what's all available to you. And you may not understand why it's worthwhile to go outside of Facebook. And so that was also incredibly problematic. So there are a lot of sort of, I think, interesting attempts at, trying to crack the nut of like, how do we provide, a lower cost access, but as long as there's this sort of like element that can be sort of seen as craven, as like, oh, like, then I'll take your data, or you only get to exist in the walled garden and otherwise you get like super upcharged. I feel like those attempts are going to repeatedly fail, or cause problems where they do take hold.
Yeah. I'm old enough to remember when, for a lot of people, the internet only looked like AOL or CompuServe. So I really hope that our lawmakers are conscious of not going back in that direction. All right. We have a last little trademark nugget to leave you with before we conclude the show. It's definitely not a little nugget at all for Simon Tam and the Slants, who 6 years to the day after they filed their application to register their band name, the Slants, were awarded it this week. So they have now received their federal trademark after 8 years of litigation and a Supreme Court decision in their favor. So congratulations to Simon Tam and the Slants. And in their honor, our second MCLE pass race for the show is going to be the Slants TM. So good news for our friends Simon and the Slants, and we're thrilled for them that their long journey has finally paid off. What were you going to say, Matt?
He always said that his first attorney told him that it was going to be quick and cheap to get his trademark, and I don't think that worked out. But it is good that he finally got it.
Yes. So wanted to pass along that good news. And we will get into our concluding material for the show. We have a number of resources of the week for you. One is to the topic of what we've been discussing throughout the show today, and that is Net Inclusion 2018. This is an event being put on by the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. Can you tell us more about it, Amina?
Yeah, it's a great conference where we have a number of folks in the digital inclusion community come together. So these might be community broadband organizations, libraries, schools, cities, states, anybody who's interested in ensuring access to broadband for their hard-to-serve community members. We always have industry, providers, government as well participate, which is really great at the federal, state, and local level. It's a pretty positive event in that you got so many people who are actively working on this issue. And there are so many interesting stories, and there's so many interesting ways of cracking the nut of reaching the hardest to reach. I think one takeaway that I've had from attending and participating in Net Inclusion in the past is just that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to digital inclusion. you can talk about infrastructure, but at the end of the day, you've got to have a plan for how you get the person connected, whether it's a cost support or a helping hand when your computer will inevitably shut down or do the blue screen of death, or, understanding how to use Twitter, whatever it is that, will get this person online, you're going to need a helping hand in doing that. And the Net Inclusion Conference brings together folks who have been doing just that all across the United States and internationally.
That's great. It will be April 17th through 19th in Cleveland, Ohio. So if you are interested in the topics we've been covering today, that would be a great place to find yourself at that time. One other resource I wanted to get from you, it's probably a series of resources, Amina, is for folks who need help ensuring access and assistance. And particularly if you don't already have it, what would you recommend as the best resource and starting place?
So the difficult issue, of course, with access to the internet is that most of our resources are, held online. So, like telling someone to go to a website so they can figure out how to get online is kind of strange.
Yes.
So my first piece of advice would be to go to your local library. Talk to your local public schools or a local community center or community organization that works on broadband access. And they exist all throughout the United States. I can't stress enough how useful of a resource the public libraries can be on bringing you closer to having access to broadband. Not only do most of the public libraries have access within their walls, some of them are beaming access outside of their walls, causing what's been coined as digital loitering, which means that people are hanging out outside of libraries after hours just to get access to their Wi-Fi. But that is another resource that's available. And within their walls, librarians are aware of the types of resources that might be available in your community. And once you get online, you can take advantage of some of the resources that are online. So I would actually direct people to go to the NDIA website, the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, because they have a great listing of a number of the organizations that exist all across the country. And those are organizations that hopefully will be in your community, so you would be able to reach out to them directly.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. Our tip of the week this week is it stems from an article at The New Scientist, and it's all about some information about doxing and doxing attacks. And I recommend the article in particular. It describes some research done by scholars at NYU and the University of Illinois at Chicago, just about what is happening and what it looks like. If you're not familiar with the term, and I'm suspect I'm probably less familiar than most of our listeners are, but doxing is when someone is the information from someone is taken and published against their will in a public forum intended for dissemination and abuse. So not only is all your information out there, but then, it's posted somewhere where the intended recipients are asked to then take up that information or encouraged to take up that information and do bad things with it. The article starts with setting up an account in their name to request child pornography, bank accounts hacked, money stolen from the accounts, their employer phoned and told bad things about them, et cetera, et cetera. That is what doxing is. And the tip is just to let you know, based on this research, who seems to be most targeted for these kinds of attacks. Your average age that these researchers found, if you've been subject to this, is 22. Although they had found that targets of doxing were between ages 10 and 74, the average age seemed to be 22 or so. If you were younger, you were more likely to have been a target. And also, and they sort of say take this with a grain of salt, but 82% of the targets were men, and the researchers chalk that up to demographically, you're more likely to be doxxed if you're a hacker or a gamer. It's more prominent in those communities, which tend to be more male to begin with. And I think their point in saying, don't assume that men are more vulnerable here is just because the phenomenon is beginning to spread outside of those communities. So just some statistics from New Scientist that I thought were interesting. And of course, we will now leave you with our animal selfie of the week. We have a couple of things to highlight in our animal selfie segment here. The first is the fact that Naruto and the case were the subject of a segment on NPR on its This American Life show. I've certainly bookmarked it to listen to over the weekend. It's about 30 minutes long, so haven't had the chance yet, but Victor has. So Victor, in the studio, why don't you tell us a bit about what people can expect if they tune in to the animal selfie episode of This American Life?
Yeah, it's I'm sure to our listeners it's nothing new, but I just get this podcast on my feed automatically. So when they started the story, I was like, oh, I think I know where this is going. But yeah, it's the cool part about it is that you actually hear them talking to is it David Slater, the photographer?
Yes, he was the
David
photographer.
Slater. So they start from when he got the photo and all throughout the all the lawsuits he went through with PETA and I believe Wikimedia, right? And essentially, most of it's from his side of the story, but you do hear audio from the courtroom of like PETA's lawyers' arguments, and I mean you can't help but feel for Slater, what they were putting him through, both Wikimedia and PETA's lawyer. But it's a real interesting listen, just hearing it all at one time.
Yeah, definitely. I'm gonna tune in. The tease for it on NPR's website talks about how David Slater went to Indonesia. He got some stunning photos of monkeys. What he couldn't imagine was that he'd end up being sued for copyright infringement by one of the monkeys. And we're talking about Simon Tam and his long road to his trademark registration. This is one that David Slater did not even initiate himself.
Right.
Of course, he
This
just
one
thought
doesn't
he'd
feel
put
as
out.
good.
Sorry?
This one doesn't feel as good.
No, it doesn't feel as good. It,
Well, and
he hoped to put out a booklet of wonderful nature photography, and he did so with Blurb, which also got sued, and they were going to make a little bit of money on it, and it probably wouldn't have sold very well anyway, and hasn't wound up selling very well anyway. Maybe more as the result of the lawsuit. I certainly hope so.
I thought it was funny how, and I'm just going off the top of my head, but it like hearing it in this way as a story, it really highlights how ridiculous some of this is, and like how at one point in some of the courtroom audio, like after the PETA lawyer, I think it was during the appeals process, they put their case, and then Slater's lawyer and was it the Blurb that published the book that you were saying?
Yeah, Blurb is a book, a make your own book company.
Right. And like basically they went up and all their thing was, we're being sued by a monkey. That's it. That was their argument. But it's a very interesting, for the amount that we talk about it on this show, it was interesting hearing it, like in there, hearing it straight from like Slater and the people involved. So
yes, many viewers and listeners emailed me, oh, you've got to listen to this. They did a great job. So can't wait to do that. We have one other animal selfie of the week tidbit to leave you with, actually, the beautiful imagery of Katharina Perini, if I'm saying her name correctly. She lives in the hills near San Mateo, California, and she's an avid backpacker. And what she decided to do, because she had seen mountain lion tracks near her home, etc., and I think caught a glimpse of one in her driveway, according to this article at the 650. She decided to put up a bunch of motion-activated cameras in her area, and she has gotten just some stunning shots of the wildlife in her area. Lots of mountain lions, and mountain lions doing very sort of, I don't know. I mean, I don't expect a mountain lion to see pictures of a mountain lion stretching or sitting there looking like a house cat. And this is what she's managed to capture. Animals hunting, baby bobcats that are just adorable. Really some beautiful animal photography and video. She has an Instagram account as well. The name of her account is Bergenwald. And so you can follow her there. But again, the reason we bring this up in our animal selfie segment is that much like the Naruto case we were discussing, there was no human photographer of these gorgeous shots. They were all taken by motion-activated cameras. I want to know what cameras she's using. She's getting really gorgeous imagery out of them. And cool. Sorry, what were you saying?
Oh, just the bird's cool.
Yeah, the bird is really cool. Wonderful thing to highlight, and we wonder and hope that poor Katharina will not be subjected to any lawsuits about who owns the copyright to her photography or her camera's photography on her behalf. So one to highlight for you as we round out our show. Such a great discussion with Amina Fazlullah today. Amina, we really appreciate you taking all this time and helping us understand some very complicated and very important issues. Is there anything, we've already highlighted the Net Inclusion Conference coming up next spring. Anything else you want to leave listeners and viewers with before we sign off for the day?
I guess I'd just add that, I'm going to be working on these issues over the next year or so with as a tech policy fellow for Mozilla. So I really welcome any input or any interesting stories or ideas people have had that our discussion around digital inclusion, digital divide, access to infrastructure has spurred. I really hope to spend the next year pulling together sort of the best learnings around how to get access to hard-to-reach communities and what's required once you get access to make sure everyone gets online. So excited to hear from the This Week in Law universe for their feedback.
Thank you. Yes, I hope that you do hear from our audience. And congratulations, too, on obtaining that Mozilla Fellowship. They are not easy to get, and you are in very good company. We're thrilled that you did and that you're doing this work, and we're really grateful that you've joined us here today.
Thank you.
Matt Curtis, always a pleasure to chat with you. I hope you have a great weekend, and probably won't see you next week, but the week after.
That sounds great. Thanks so much
actually,
for
next
having
week
me on.
next week is Thanksgiving, so
yes,
we won't see any of you next week. We do hope you have a lovely holiday, though.
I will be sick of leftover turkey by next Friday. So,
yes.
But thanks for having me on again, and thank you so much for joining us, Amina.
Thank you.
Folks, if you've joined us live today, that means that you've tuned in at 11 o'clock Pacific time, 1900 UTC on a Friday, and that's when we record the shows. We won't be recording next week. It is the Thanksgiving holiday. Our whole network is closed, but we definitely will be back after that, and that is our recording window. So if you'd like to join us live, that is the time when you should set aside to join us, jump into our IRC at irc.twit.tv. play along as we record the show live. But if you can't, don't worry about it. Head on over to twit.tv/TWiL. Our entire archive of shows is there for your enjoyment at your leisure. And there are also instructions, suggestions on how you might want to enjoy the show on the device of your choice, in the context of your choice. So please go on over there and check out our show page. And if you are enjoying the show through iTunes or YouTube or however you listen, if you do enjoy the show or have feedback of any kind, please leave us comments there. Or if you would rather reach out to us directly, I am Denise at twit.tv. Matt is Matt C at twit.tv. Please shoot us an email. Find us on Twitter. The show has a page there, as do I. I'm D Howell there, and Matt is Law Pint there. The show also has a Facebook page, which is a great place. If 280 characters is not enough for you to express what you'd like to get across to us, head on over to the Facebook page. We try and post up stories there all week, so you'll have an idea what we're thinking about as we get ready for the show. Also, a great way to participate is to subscribe to and or become a contributor to our Flipboard magazine. That's at flipboard.com. At D Howell is my moniker there. You'll see I have a number of magazines, and the one, logically enough, for the show is This Week in Law. And then the other thing I'm supposed to plug, I believe, is as we're rounding toward the end of the year here, we do some best of shows on the network. So we would love to get your ideas for what to include in a 2017 clip show for This Week in Law. Victor, where should people go if they're interested in submitting their ideas?
twit.tv/bestof.
There we go. So we definitely hope that you'll head on over there, help us out in generating, as we head into the holiday season here, something that will play around, in that week between the winter break, right around New Year's. So we're thrilled that you've joined us this week. We hope you've learned a lot. We know we have. And we hope you enjoy a wonderful holiday week next week. We will see you after that on This Week in Law.